I want to get started because I want to make sure we have enough time to enjoy all of these great presentations that we're going to get to hear. What we'll do is have the presenters will each have 8 to 10 minutes, and then after their presentation, there'll be 5 minutes for questions for them. And then maybe if we have a little bit of time at the end, depending on how it goes, there might be time for a few more kind of follow-up questions at the very end. But welcome and thank you for coming to this presentation with the theme education. My name is Yolanda Padilla and I'm really honored to be moderating the panel. Our first presenter is going to be Amados Chacon. The title of his presentation is The Mexican-American Experience, Healing Through Ethnic Studies and Bilingualism. Amado?
Hello everyone, I'm Amados Chacon. To be honest, it kind of sucks that I'm the first presenter. Some of those who are going to be presenting, please learn from my mistakes. And the mistakes I might probably make would be worthless if you guys don't really learn from this. Anyways, going on. So my research is about the benefits of ethnic studies and bilingual education, looking at it through the lens of Mexican Americans. But before I really get into this presentation, I want to start off with a brief acknowledgement that I believe this fits for any race. The only problem is I'm not every race. Right? I'm Mexican American. My research comes from the Mexican American background, and so because of that, I can only really focus on my own. But before I really get into the research that I discovered, I want to start off with the background information I had to begin with, right? You can't go off immediately to what you learn without saying what you knew before. And what I knew before was that of Mexican culture, right? Growing up within a Mexican household, surrounded in a Mexican community, I learned pretty early on that there is this hierarchy of culture within the United States, with the U.S. Anglo-American at the top, Mexican American somewhere on the bottom. And it was very prominent within how I saw with education, right? With education and what we learned. And another example of how this hierarchy was with what the parents really taught you. Immigrant parents often would teach their children to speak English and not really express their culture because of this hierarchy and this fear that if they're teaching their children how to speak Spanish, how to be Mexican culture itself, they are hindering them to succeed here in the United States. And this would lead to this generation that live here feeling of being too American to be Mexican, but too Mexican to be American. And often than not, we'd be the ones that blamed for being too American. I think I have an image of, right on the bottom, of a band called Yaritza y Su Esencia, a group from here from Washington who felt this in media where essentially they were kind of canceled by all of Mexico because they didn't really understand the Mexican culture as Mexico understood it. Another thing that I knew was that of personal identity. In the United States, it focuses on this idea of personal identity and how it's so important through high school and middle school. Like, you need to figure out yourself, and by the time you're in college, you want to know what you want to do. You got to know that what you're going to do with your life so that your college education is not wasted. And an issue for many is that one of the key components, which is cultural identity, isn't really implemented in this, right? Because cultural identity is formed through understanding of oneself, one's history, one's culture. And yet, when your parents don't teach you and when the schools don't teach you, where are you gonna get this cultural identity? You can learn it from your peers, but your peers are the same weight as you. And so, going on to the education. The U.S. education is flawed. It's a little out of date. And so when you have this system that doesn't really show that you are worthy or that you're talked about, you feel this sense of emptiness. And that when it's implemented by media, it makes it worse, especially with the negative stereotypes in the media of Mexican American. And so I was curious, this is actually part of the research, but I was curious to look at the percentage of minority Mexican Americans that went to college. And it was about 33% applied to college, and all of those 30%
really only 26% getting an associate's degree. And the issue with that is, with how society is right now, you kind of need an associate's degree if you want to succeed in life. You're required to get education and experience, and when you can't get the education that you're required, how can you really leave that situation you're born in? Now, I knew these issues growing up in high school and just by being myself. And so these issues I wanted to look at. How can we use education to address this inequality? How can we change the current curricula to help students succeed? Because if this education is the problem, how to fix it? And in my research, I discovered this term, historical trauma. Now, historical trauma is the cumulative trauma that is experienced both the lifespan and across generations. The result from massive cataclysmic event. There are three types of historical trauma: genocide, colonialism, and slavery. For Mexican Americans, it is colonialism. And I think Mexican Americans have it kind of like double because we experienced double colonialism through the Spanish colonization of the Americas, through the Mexican American War, and what happened after from with the racism and the stealing of land and etc. Of these responses, I found this really beautiful article. I recommend you look. It's the historical trauma and resilience of individual Mexican Americans in the United States by Roscoe Figueroa, and where she identifies three responses to historical trauma. That is the community response, the family response, and the individual response. The family response is one that's tied to language. Language where because of this loss of language, the Spanish language, the communication between families is somewhat shattered, because when you have parents that don't speak English and children who don't speak Spanish, how are you going to communicate with one another? The community response is kind of built up from all of these, because as you have this breaking of family and breaking of individuals, you don't really have a sense of community. But the one that's tied most to education is that of the individual. Right? The individual response is tied to vulnerability, to increased vulnerability to behavioral problems, including anxiety, depression, and substance use disorders. And often observed individuals raised in the United States within Mexican families, meaning it's often found within people who were born or raised in the United States, who went to a U.S. education, basically experienced the education system. And they're all interconnected. That's what I've discovered. Impact. Education, there's negative impacts, lack of historical cultural knowledge, loss of language. There's this cycle because of this lack, there is somewhat psychological barriers with it. So Christine Slater, a very prominent researcher within the topic of ethnic studies, findings suggest that psychological barriers hinder educational attainment for BIPOC students, perpetuating the cycle of historical trauma. And so essentially, this trauma and this mentality focuses that where you don't really have that want to learn, you don't have, sometimes you don't feel like it's worth learning when you're just going to end up like your parents. Which leads me to kind of like the examples. One of the prominent examples that I found in an academic itself, he went to college, did all this, is that of Richard Rodriguez. Born around like the 1950s, he born to immigrant parents, and as a way to deal with this trauma, what he did was that he essentially abandoned his Spanish language and his culture to the point where, like, if you read, I'd definitely recommend reading this book. It's a really good insight on the mindset of how this affects Mexican Americans, where essentially he says, my parents are no longer my parents. And so you can see how, because of how education had pushed this mentality where he needs to be separated from his parents in order to succeed. Moving on to my interviews. Because of Richard Rodriguez's that example, I really was helped with my interviews, where I interviewed 7 people and kind of wanted to figure out, look at the key pattern of this. I didn't want to really stick with Richard Rodriguez because it's just one person. I need multiple people. I need to do my own research. And in my research, I discovered that this link between educational attainment and understanding one's cultures. Of those that I researched, the ones that were most connected to their culture were the ones that wanted to learn the most. one that really stuck out to me was Teresa Saldivar-Nebker, who grew up in Utah in the 1960s, in this area full of racism and a lot of like anti-Mexican mentality. And because of her father, who taught her own Mexican culture, and because of which inspired her to research more, where she learned about the Mesoamerican pyramids and all the architectural stuff that Aztecs did at a time where there was no technology, she wanted to really get into architecture. And that, out of everyone in her family, she was the only one that really pushed forward to college. So with my research, I discovered there are 3 defenses along with responses. There's that of self-segregation, which is essentially separating yourself from the colonial power. Assimilation, which is that of essentially just becoming falling into the colonial culture, and that of integration. What I discovered is that integration is the most important, because you need to keep your cultural background while also fitting within the culture you're surrounded. That way you can succeed with it. You can both be proud of yourself and interact with the society around you. That's why it's important to have ethnic studies and bilingualism, right? Ethnic studies teaches you, the purpose of ethnic studies is to eliminate racism, decolonize students' minds, and to sustain minoritized cultures, and concepts which even at the most basic level can make a difference in a child's lifetime. At the most basic level, one of my interviews that I did with the teacher, and where he talked about how in his class, in his science class even, he talked a little bit about Day of the Dead, and how that little tidbit of information really helped his students focus, pay attention, and made them more active and engaged within his classroom. And again, it's not even in social studies class that this is important, that you need to have this. You can just include this in every subject, as long as the teacher is willing and able to include little tidbits of culture and voices. But why many people wonder, why would we do this, right? Why, if it only benefits one student, why would we want to do this if it only benefits one group of students, right? But studies actually show that it benefits all students, right? Ethnic studies and bilingualism benefit not only Mexican American students, but all students by broadening perspectives and promoting empathy through exposure to diverse cultures and languages. Incorporating diverse perspectives into the curriculum enriches students' understanding of the world and prepares them. I just want to, I'm sorry.
Should we move to the, okay,
Yeah.
can you put in like one sentence?
Yeah, I can include
Okay.
one sentence. Sorry. You tried doing an essay into like a 10-minute presentation. It's a lot. You guys understand, right? Sorry. The United States is the land of many cultures, and more often than not, we only focus on one. And while progress has been made to include more diverse voices, it's been rather slow. That's why it's important for teachers to do the work themselves, for parents to teach their children, and for children to go out to learn. Because without knowing your culture or history, how can you know yourself?
We have 5 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you so much for this really fantastic presentation. I loved it. I wanted to just pivot a little bit. You talk about the ways in which, as Mexican Americans or any hyphenated identities in this country or across the world, they suffer from a cultural alienation from their own originary culture. So the reason I wanted to pivot away, because I wanted to use your expression of decolonialism to say the ways in which people in former colonies across the world, people continue to be colonized. So that I can give the example of India, where I grew up, where there is a push against our own mother tongue so that we all learn English. Because without the use of English, you can't get jobs and things like that. To the extent that there are some languages, I mean, my mother tongue is Hindi and it's quite a widely spoken language, but some of the smaller minority languages, like Punjabi, it's disappearing. Yeah, people speak and understand, but they don't learn to write. And the next few generations, even that ability will go. And I wondered whether you had thoughts on that.
I do. So I ran across that topic actually because I really wanted to focus on the United States. I didn't really talk about that, but it's because of kind of like global culturalization, right? What is the most popular culture right now, and what's kind of like where everyone gets their experience from, right? But TikTok, U.S. sites, Hollywood from U.S. media. So because of the United States is essentially just pushing all their culture out. It's like with the French or like the Renaissance, right? Where the society that pushes out their culture to the world and like publishes it all is the one that's going to be considered the what you want to be. And because of that, that's why you experience that in India and other places in the world, even Mexico, where a lot of Mexican children are now using more English slang within their language.
We'll do one more question.
Yeah, so great presentation, by the way. I really loved it and sharing your experiences as well. I was curious when it comes to when you said about the kind of alienation of losing the language because of this assimilating to this larger culture. I was wondering if you had read anything kind of more linguistic theory, right? On the idea of how actually knowing multiple languages, like say knowing Spanish and being able to see the world almost in that language instead of English actually could be seeing the world in a different way, and how that might play into as well that alienation of when you don't have that language, then you're really looking at something that may be the same as everybody else, but you're seeing it in a different way because you have this only a certain way to talk about it.
So I've read stuff like that, but because of the time constraint I had and the situation, I couldn't really get into the more just concrete sources. But yes, from what I've learned is that language essentially changes your brain, right? So where it creates pathways, and as you progress, the older you get, the pathways kind of die. And so essentially by having this language, you kind of see the world in a different way. Because of the way language works, sometimes the subject is different than in a different language, and so on and so forth. But yeah, so.
Great, thank you.